and welcome to Economics Unbound. I'm Thandeka Qubulembeki, and as usual, I'm not alone. I'm with Nana. Good evening, Nana, and dear viewer. Tonight, we share the main features of a global discussion about what we can learn as Africa and South Africa about the management of COVID-19 as a pandemic and as an economic crisis from Asian countries. So in short, we are asking the question, Nana and I, what can we learn from Asia about the management of COVID-19?
Good evening, Tans. It is true that we have much to learn from Asia, and we are certain that we too are instructive to other nations. Tans, is it not impressive that China brought a full-fledged and rapidly spreading epidemic under control in just a few weeks, a feat many experts thought was impossible? This achievement was not without its controversies, though. But what we can learn about it is so to insulate ourselves and protect our society and economy from future pandemics and economic shocks, after all. The Zulu saying, "Indlela ibuzwa kwabaphambili," means those who have gone ahead of us know the journey and the road's pitfalls better than us. We must learn from them. After all, the multiple dimensions of the crisis are unprecedented and largely unknowable, so we must ask those ahead.
You know, Nana, I'm very impressed with Vietnam. It's almost as if the war that Vietnam waged was a new war on COVID-19. Vietnam is China's highly densely populated neighbor, and they managed their numbers and contagion downwards very impressively. Now, according to emerging research and high-quality expert opinions, East Asian countries have outperformed the rest of us in terms of the management of controlling COVID-19 as a pandemic and as an economic crisis, Nana.
Dear viewer and Tans, despite the fact that the outbreak was first registered in China last year, an important point of departure is to begin with this graph that shows us the numbers comparatively, so that we can have a rich picture of what is going on. Some countries in Asia have managed to reduce the number of active COVID-19 cases drastically. This week, New Zealand announced that it had 0 active cases. Let us listen to their very fetching leader.
Today, there are no active cases in New Zealand. We have tested almost 40,000 people for COVID-19 in the past 17 days, and none have tested positive. We have had no one in hospital for COVID-19 for 12 days. It's been 40 days since the last case of community transmission, 22 days since that person finished their self-isolation. And so today, I can announce that Cabinet has agreed we will now move to level 1 to get our economy fully open again, and we will start almost immediately. We move down to COVID-19 alert level 1 from midnight tonight. We are not immune to what is happening in the rest of the world. But unlike the rest of the world, not only have we protected New Zealanders' health, we now have a head start on our economic recovery. That's because at level 1 we become, if not the most open, one of the most open economies in the world. At level 1, we expect the continuation of recovery. After all, at level 1 we can hold public events without limitations. Private events such as wedding functions and funerals without limitations. Retail is back without limitations. Hospitality is back without limitations. Public transport and travel across the country is fully opened. This freedom from restrictions relies so heavily on the ongoing role that our border controls will play in keeping the virus out. But we must remain mindful of the global situation, the harsh reality that the virus will be in our world for some time to come. We are confident we have eliminated transmission of the virus in New Zealand for now, but elimination is not a point in time. It is a sustained effort. We almost certainly will see cases here again. And I do want to say that again. We will almost certainly see cases here again. And that is not a sign that we have failed. It is a reality of this virus. But if and when that occurs, we have to make sure, and we are, that we are prepared. as we move from the collective call to action to unite against COVID-19 to unite for recovery. I encourage you to buy, play and experience New Zealand Made to get our country moving again. Consider it an extra form of support to visit our country, to buy our local products and to support our local businesses. What I would re-emphasise is that our border is critical. The reason that New Zealanders, as of tomorrow, will be able to move around with freedom that very few other countries in the world have is because we are maintaining those restrictions at the border, so they will continue to be critical. And that means applying a really critical analysis if and when we come to a position where we believe another country is in a similar position to us and therefore we can safely travel between. We haven't put an arbitrary timeline on it because that simply comes down to a judgment that does rely on daily data, and it's simply the case that at the moment those decisions we are just not ready to make yet.
Now, Preeti prepared a graph with some of the figures. She'll walk us through the pandemic in numbers and show that it is as if the two regions are different worlds. Europe and the US are seriously overwhelmed by the virus as of the 7th of April 2020. I know that we're in June now, but the figures even back then are instructive. Please take us through them, Preeti.
The COVID-19 pandemic began in Asia, in Wuhan, China, and has spread widely through the continent. The COVID-19 pandemic began in Asia, in Wuhan, China, and has spread widely through the continent. As of the 8th of June 2020, at least one case of COVID-19 had been reported in every country in Asia except North Korea. Countries with the highest numbers of confirmed coronavirus cases are India, Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Among the earliest countries to report COVID-19 cases after the outbreak in China were South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, but these countries had successfully controlled the pandemic. The highest numbers of deaths are recorded in Iran, India, Turkey, China and Pakistan, with more than 27,000 deaths combined. The death tolls in a number of countries, however, are claimed to significantly higher than those given to the official figures.
The interesting thing, Tandeka, is that Google has recently brought out the most fascinating sets of data. The data zeroed in on the reduction of activity in various sectors of the economy. So, Tans, I imagine that they had aerial shots of street life and economic activity. And the fact that I would like to zero in on is that comparing economic activity in Asia versus that in Western capital cities. There was more economic activity in Asian countries and cities as they did not implement in some parts a strict lockdown. So the streets are less deserted, and this would explain why the economic effects are less severe in East Asia. So bullish was China, feeling that she decided to scrap some foreign debt.
Well, the move by China will certainly come as a massive relief for many African nations that make up a significant proportion of that group of 77 developing countries and regions. And it comes on top of the $2 billion that Beijing has pledged to help developing nations in their fight against COVID-19. But it didn't necessarily come as a huge surprise because it's very much in line with what the G20 had previously offered from May onwards, and China did say previously that it would work in line with the group of 20 nations and wouldn't offer any preferential treatment to any of its partners. But of course, some African nations have been saying that they may need more than just loan relief and perhaps some form of debt forgiveness as well. Some have suggested that it may be difficult for China to do that simply because of the scale of the debt that China holds with Africa, estimated to be around $150 billion. But the bigger question really is what sort of investment and credit China can offer Africa in the long term. Of course, China is facing its own economic woes, and that is going to be difficult, may have a knock-on effect, if you like, on African countries who will be looking for investment and loans to try and kickstart their economies in the wake of this coronavirus pandemic?
Experts indicate that East Asian countries were, after all, better prepared. There's a culture there of wearing a mask even if you're just afflicted by a common flu, so as to not go around leaving droplets and transmitting disease. Also on public transport and on flights, it's not uncommon that people in East Asia would wear masks. The 2003 SARS outbreak was a wake-up call, and frequent waves of dengue fever in several East Asian countries reinforced the message. In Europe and the US, concerns over SARS, Ebola, Zika and dengue fever seemed far away, abstract, and just something not to worry about. Prudy, please take us through the top 10 lessons.
Countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam, they have all successfully managed the health crisis and managed to keep the economy going, of course, at the lower level because the rest of the world was in deep trouble. Keep the economy going at a decent pace. But there are similarities and differences between these countries. So the similarities is that all of them used early intervention and effective centrally coordinated public intervention. But some countries have managed it in a more transparent and democratic ways than others, such as South Korea and Taiwan, thanks to their strong democratic politics. Also, countries have treated their residents in different ways. You know, for example, in some countries, the migrant laborers were treated rather poorly despite overall success. I'm talking about cases like Singapore and Hong Kong, where in general the containment was really successful, but the crowded conditions in the migrant quarters created exceptional levels of disease by the country's standards. So yes, I mean, I think the experiences show, on the one hand, the importance of early intervention and centralized coordination, but also shows how your political culture, your democratic scrutiny, and transparency in the process also make a difference.
What do you think we can learn from the experience of Southeast Asia and the countries that you've mentioned?
Oh, yeah, I think there are quite a lot of lessons. But first of all, in terms of the management of the health crisis, I think what this cases teach you is that when you have a crisis that affects everyone, you know, pandemic is one example. Another is the climate crisis that is beginning to seriously affect all sorts of countries around the world. When you have that kind of situation, you know, there's no question that you need centralized coordination and strong intervention. So a lot of more economically advanced countries in Europe, in North America, you know, they kind of postponed intervention on the ground that is somehow against their free market principles. But look at the result. I mean, as a result of late intervention, lack of central coordination, they have suffered more economically despite having had to restrict the people's freedom a lot more through this lockdown process. But in the economic sphere, I think that they have, the Asian countries have shown that you need strong macroeconomic stimulus packages. You know, some countries are worried that if the government spends money to float the economy in this situation, wouldn't public debt go up? But you know, the deal is really that if the government doesn't rack up debt, the private sector will, and then they have a much higher chance of going bankrupt. So I think the Asian countries have intervened quite early with by the region standard, very strong the stimulus package. So that's one lesson to learn. But also they have shown that you need to really extend social protection to everyone if you're going to fight something like this pandemic, because especially in America, a lot of workers that because they didn't have sick leave, because they don't have unemployment insurance, started going to work despite having symptoms and spread the disease quite widely. In Asian countries, they extended social protection, at least temporarily, so that people don't have to risk their health and other people's health to control the situation. And finally, in the longer term, these countries have shown that, in the anticipation of the forthcoming changes in the economic activities and structure that are going to become inevitable because of this pandemic, at least in the next 4 or 5 years, they have acted very early to restructure the manufacturing sector, anticipate new demands and develop new sectors, and really trying to kind of use this as an opportunity to kind of move to the next level. So I think that kind of forward-looking approach is another thing that other countries really need to learn.
Now, talking about forward-looking approaches, our country has a very high unemployment level. The unemployment levels, you are no stranger to the South African economy, and our unemployment levels were reaching something around 30%. Now it's projected that these may reach 50%. Wouldn't that make our society basically not viable? And what should we do about this?
Yeah, no, I mean, South Africa has always had unemployment rate which is one of the highest in the world, and the country was sustained only because at the grassroots level you have so much solidarity and mutual assistance. But yes, I mean, in the long run, I mean, it's absurd that to have an official unemployment rate of 25% at the lowest, usually 30%, and now likely to approach 50%. So this means that the economy really needs to be restructured in such a way that you generate more jobs, you accelerate growth, and you protect everyone by extending the welfare schemes and unemployment insurance and so on. Unfortunately, the political deal that has been in place since the end of the apartheid has not been very good for that kind of arrangement, because basically the deal was that the ANC government does not touch the mineral and financial sectors, and yeah, the result has been basically that you create a policy environment where it is only serving the interests of the mineral and financial sector. So, for example, you have run very tight macroeconomic policy, which has kept the real interest rate, that is the interest rate after inflation, at one of the highest levels in the world, and have kept the currency overvalued, which has been detrimental to the manufacturing sector. You should not forget that in the 1960s, South Africa was literally the most industrialized country outside Europe and North America.
And now we've decimated our industrial base.
Exactly, yeah. In the early 60s, South Africa was producing something like 6 times more industrial output per capita than South Korea. Today it's barely 10%. Yeah. So basically you have destroyed the industry by creating this macroeconomic policy environment that is extremely hostile to investment and productivity growth, because interest rates are so high, companies cannot borrow money to expand. Currency is overvalued. You cannot export. How are you going to create the output and jobs? And on top of that, the social arrangement in the post-apartheid period has not been enough to elevate the majority black population to the new levels of education, skills, and health. I mean, of course, that a lot of things have been done, but I don't think it was enough to create an industrial.
Now, Professor,
for modern industry.
With COVID, do you believe that this deal has now been nullified by circumstances and that we have a new opportunity to create a new economic policy landscape, and that COVID has effectively flattened the old deal and rendered it null and void? Do you think that could possibly be the case?
Frankly, looking at the recent election results, the social pact that was formed right after the end of apartheid was already creaking at the seams. The ANC was struggling to maintain its the majority. But yes, this COVID crisis has very strongly revealed how insufficient that old post-apartheid social pact has been. And yes, I frankly think that this is not just an opportunity, but an imperative. Unless you write this deal again at this point, with the shocks coming from COVID crisis, with the falling foreign investment, falling the exports, that you are going to have, as you think you might, the 50% unemployment rate, maybe even higher, then the society will become totally unviable. So I think this is not just an opportunity, but it is imperative that you have to reconsider this social pact and come up with a new one.
Do you think that we should do it deliberately and systematically, or do you believe that perhaps we should let it happen organically, or has it already collapsed organically and in fact we have no choice but to preside over a new economic policy and a new social compact?
Well, if any country can do it, it will be South Africa. The transition it made, I mean, even though the resulting the social pact was, as we just discussed, not totally satisfactory, the kind of transition that it engineered from one of the most vicious racist regimes in the world to the democratic, if not imperfect, society, that is unprecedented in human history. So if any country can do it, it will be South Africa. And I think you already have the record, and then you already have the political parties and social organizations that can do it in a very systematic, negotiated way. Because, yes, I mean, sometimes if you don't have these organized forces, it may be better to let things evolve, because without those forces, it might lead to chaos if you try to do it too quickly. But South Africa is one country that has that political
Would you call it political DNA? Would you say that it's in our political DNA?
Yeah, absolutely. And frankly, the level of political consciousness and social organization and solidarity among the general public in the country is one of the highest in the world.
Now, so getting back to COVID, how do you think we can behave now to ensure that we build a more egalitarian society and a more equitable sharing of the benefits of the economy going forward? We need to build that now during the COVID management process. How do we best do that?
Yes, it's a good opportunity because in the short run, you by extending the health provision for everyone, by extending social protection like unemployment insurance and so on, you can build new solidarities and strengthen the old ones. Even South Korea, which has been a very anti-welfare state kind of country for a long time, is now talking about introducing a generalized unemployment insurance scheme, not just for regular workers, but people who are running small businesses as self-employed people who don't have full-time stable contracts. So, that in other countries, this has actually created a new sense of solidarity, new realization that everyone has to be in it together. So South Africa could use this crisis as an occasion to extend the social consensus and introduce new measures. But also in the medium to long run, the country has to come up with a new economic strategy, in the post-COVID world. For example, services like tourism and finance that South Africa has relied on very strongly, they are going to be very, very weak. Some segments of these sectors might completely disappear. So how are we going to make that up? Of course, by expanding the manufacturing sector. And in order to move forward with that, the country needs to invest in the machines, worker skills, research and development. It needs, in order to be able to do that, it needs a new financial system because the current financial system is very good at making short-term money, but is very bad at providing long-term finance for things like research, training, machinery investment, which required a long time horizon. So the whole system needs to be restructured, and I think this is a very good opportunity to do that.
Professor Ha-Joon Chang, if you were to sit in our cabinet and advise our president, what would you say the two main features of our recovery plan ought to be?
Oh, yeah, I think the first thing will be greater solidarity. So you need to get out of this crisis in a way that elevates everyone together. And it's one crisis that everyone has to work together to overcome because, unlike other diseases, rich people cannot just buy the medicine for themselves and hide, unless 80-90% of population have access to vaccine and treatments, even the richest people cannot be safe. So we need to drill that into people's mind and say we are going to face many crises like this in the coming years, most importantly the climate crisis, and we need to build a system that has greater solidarity. But secondly, I would emphasize that you need to focus on expanding the technological and productive capabilities of the country, because the country has fought long just try to live off its mineral resources and its financial skills without really building up the productive capabilities. I repeat, the country used to be the most industrialized country outside Europe and North America until the 1960s. Why are you today producing only 10% of manufacturing output per capita compared to South Korea, which was producing not even 15% of what South Africa was producing in the 1960s? So
and
you need to ask that question and focus on.
And you basically put the blame at the kind of deal and the nature of the macroeconomic policies that we adopted post-apartheid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that those macroeconomic policies might have been necessary right at the beginning of the transition. I'm not naive enough to say that the ANC government just could do anything at that time. But, after a while, I mean, having established that the country's economic stability, I mean, it should have moved on to something that is more long-term oriented, something that is more inclusive, something that is more kind of technologically advanced. It hasn't made that transition. So basically, the economy has been stuck in the same place, and if anything, has relatively declined. And you still have 30% unemployment. You still have a difficult balance of payment situation. You know, I would say that the initial transition, the fact that the strategy adopted in the very initial stage of transition that should have been corrected over time. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Much appreciated. Thank you. That was Professor Ha-Joon Chun joining us from Cambridge University, and he is a specialist in development economics and one of the leading thinkers of our time on issues of industrial policy and economic development. He is one of the advisors to many governments throughout the world, and we are very grateful that he was able to join us earlier from Cambridge University in the UK. And now, right now, we have a package by Prudence Makubalo, and she's going to walk us through exactly what lessons we can learn from Asia.
Thank you, Nana. So lesson number 1 is early intervention is key. Strike while the iron is still hot, as China did. So the second lesson is to stimulate the economy vigorously and frequently, as did Singapore in the 3 successive budgets. The size of your stimulus is as a percentage of GDP that should slightly exceed the size of the anticipated economic shock. Do not be shy to increase also public spending. So the third lesson is to keep workers attached to employment through incentives of employers and tax breaks for as long as possible. In other words, we could keep your foot on the accelerator. Do not slow down until the threat is firmly in the rear view mirror. So the fourth lesson is to deploy technology in the fight of the virus. In South Korea, technology and smartphones are being used to fight COVID-19. These are used for tracing and reporting purposes. The national surveillance of the movement of people is empowered through technology. An infringement on civil liberties, yes, but some constitutions permit the temporary suspension of some civil liberties. The fifth lesson is aggressive testing and tracing. South Korea attributes its own national success to aggressive testing, around 10,000 tests a day. South Korea did not implement a lockdown in the same way as China did, but it is one of the countries that have managed to keep a lid on infections and death. The sixth lesson is the public trust must be built up rapidly and social solidarity encouraged. Mobilization of social capital is important in fighting even the economic effects. Existing stores of public trust are helpful. In the United States, trust in the government has been falling. Singapore, it is the opposite. Public trust is consistently high. The seventh lesson is regard for human rights, civil and liberties. Enforced quarantine orders are controversial and can lead to litigation on a multiplicity of fronts. This can then break up public trust and also lead to politicization of the disease management. The eighth lesson is also the expert and research-based communication and crisis management. To respond effectively to a crisis, government needs the trust of their people, transparent in its communication about the outbreak. The ninth lesson is to ensure non-partisanship, rather promoting a culture of non-partisanship. For Asian countries manage this well. So the last lesson is a capable state crisis management, which requires not only effective policies, but appropriately adaptable governments to deliver them. That cuts red tape and is not corrupt and delivers PPEs for water and grants very fast is needed.
Well, welcome back, and thank you to Prudence for those lessons from Asia. Now on Skype, we are joined from the UK by Razia Khan, who is Chief Economist for Africa and the Middle East at Standard Chartered Bank. Welcome, Razia. Thank you for joining us. I wonder if you were listening to Ha-Joon Chang, and what struck you about what advice he had to give to South Africa. Now, I'd like us not to discuss interest rates first, but to discuss rather the discussion he had with me about the nature of the social compacts that we entered into as a people at the dawn of democracy. He seems to suggest that it has hobbled us in terms of our ability to grow as an economy and as a nation, our ability to actually deliver goods to the majority of South Africans, particularly Black South Africans. That's basically what he had to say. What's your take?
There's certainly a need to do something different, the other side of the COVID crisis. What is becoming increasingly clear with the kind of fiscal pressures that South Africa will face, and we will get a clearer view of this at the end of June with the adjustment budget, is that South Africa is going to have to dramatically accelerate its growth rate to be able to deal with the debt burden, the growing debt burden. We also know that South Africa has seen largely the absence of growth for a number of years. The economy struggling to grow above rates of 1% even before the COVID crisis.
And what Ha-Joon Chang seems to be saying is that because of the policy mix that we chose, we decimated our industrial base, our ability to be as productive as we should be in order to grow. And a number of policy choices that we took that brought us to that point led to us being hobbled as an economy even before the COVID crisis began. And COVID has merely exacerbated and revealed to us the basic structural problems. And it's basically been a dead end beyond which we cannot proceed as an economy. We cannot go along this path again. Basically, that's what he's saying. What do you think?
It's always very difficult to establish the counterfactual. So, of course, we won't know that if South Africa had chosen different policy measures, that the outcomes necessarily would have been that different. But what we do have the benefit of observing is the kind of growth characteristics that led to the emergence of the Asian tigers, of very rapidly developing economies that went on to become much more significant in their scale, and also had a much more positive experience with manufacturing. One factor that does stand out is a much higher rate of investment than South Africa has traditionally seen. What enabled that, of course, were far higher rates of savings than the South African economy has been able to benefit from. So absolutely, there is a feeling that the kind of growth rate that South Africa has achieved all along just isn't going to be sufficient. And while there may be a technical bounce in 2021 to make up for the deep contraction that everyone expects in 2020, the question is really around what drives the forward momentum beyond that. What can be put in place? What growth-enhancing reforms can be put in place to drive a far more accelerated growth rate beyond 2021? For the moment, as much as there is tentative talk about embracing reforms, it is not very clear.
Ha-Joon Chang seems to suggest that beyond just embracing certain reforms and doing a technical or a cosmetic rearrangement of the economic policy mix, what we should be doing is re-looking at the social compact that we entered into when we burst into democracy, and redoing that and recompacting as a society about who needs to expect what from whom.
Any observer of the South African economy will realize in the first instance that for many South Africans, the record in economic growth just hasn't delivered. It hasn't been good enough, and we could sit around the table debating the reasons why South Africa has been stuck in this place of very weak growth. So yes, there is something to be said about perhaps reconfiguring that social compact. But the key question here is, what can be done in a way that is going to be driving better growth outcomes, that is going to be enhancing prospects for all. Part of the reason why the inequality in South Africa may be that much more keenly felt has got a lot to do with the fact that the economy just isn't producing the growth that we should be seeing. So to try to close those income gaps is a matter of decades, not a matter of years, which might be the case if the economy were able to achieve a faster rate of real economic growth, of even a faster pace of nominal GDP growth.
Now, regarding what we can do now in response to COVID that will put us on a steady footing post-COVID, what would you say are the three main things we need to do now? Did you think, by the way, that the stimulus was enough or sufficient? And do you think that we should have waited this long for an emergency budget?
The plans were always put in place. The actual announcement of the emergency budget, the adjustment budget on June the 24th, makes little difference to the actual outcome. What is very clear to all observers of the South African economy is that, unfortunately, the economy had dramatically run out of available fiscal space some time before the COVID crisis. South Africa entered this downturn, this severe contraction, with several years of fiscal deficits being much larger than planned, revenue disappointment really stemming from that weak growth. And all of this could be put back to some of the policy choices earlier on that might have favored consumption at the expense of investment, the lack of broader investment confidence, the many reasons why the greater investment didn't happen, and surely savings had a role to play in that as well. The question is, what would be the right policy to pursue going forward? There's been a lot of debate, not just in South Africa, but across the Africa region, around the fact that developed economies are able to put in place so much more in the way of a fiscal stimulus. Many developed markets, of course, are undergoing unprecedented levels of QE. And understandably, there is a questioning around, would this not be the right policy for elsewhere? What we should not forget is that we do live in a very interconnected world. South Africa doesn't have the inflation characteristics of many of the developed markets that are embarking on QE, nor does it have the availability of a reserve currency. If there were to be further weakness in the rand, it would be much more destabilizing to long-term growth prospects. No one really doubts that. What South Africa can do is forge ahead with sound policy in place, and it too, because it has fairly open capital markets. It stands to be the beneficiary of these flows from elsewhere. The QE, the quantitative easing in developed markets, could have significant implications for capital flows back into the South African economy. South Africa can still benefit, but it does require that sound policy still to be adhered to. So there are many who will try to argue that maybe there is a case for doing things differently. South Africa does not have the fiscal space to be able to really embark on a very significant stimulus. What it needs to do is to put in place the conditions that will bring about growth, because there is very little else that will actually raise prospects for the majority of South Africa's population.
Razia Khan joining us from the UK. Thank you very much. And now we have got Martin Davis, the Managing Director of Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte. Good evening, Martin. How are you? Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. How are you this evening?
What do you think of this debate that I've been having with Razia, and what do you think of the main policy advice given to us by the leading economist, Hadrien Chan?
Yeah, I think Razia is undoubtedly correct. I think the challenge is here is that South Africa needs to act quite quickly. How often have we been talking about, or how long have we been talking about structural reform? It's been many, many years now. I think this COVID crisis, the only thin sliver of a silver lining is that it could ultimately, in the coming months, force so-called structural reform on our policymakers. And I actually think it will. Structural reform is, I often say, the euphemism for politically difficult to do reform. But I'm afraid it's gotten to the crunch now, and the numbers simply don't add up. The number of requests or the pressures on the fiscus, government departments, ministers having to sacrifice budget will undoubtedly, I think, force some sort of deep restructuring of, not at the same speed, of course, but different SOEs at different, in varying timeframes, but will force long overdue reform on these companies, and that's all the better for the long-term health of our economy.
Well, I've never been able to quite figure out what different people mean by structural reforms. And I'm glad that you've given us what you understand, or your definition for what it means, euphemistically, of course. But what do we do now that prevents us from paying the price of inequality? Because inequality has a cost, and it's an economic cost, and it's a social cost. It makes our lives hell, and it makes our economy and our society unviable. Now, Hajun Chan says that if we go to 50% unemployment because of COVID, if we go to as deep a contraction as has been predicted by many bodies, including the IMF and the World Bank, what can we do now to prevent our society from fraying at the seams and becoming completely unviable?
Yeah, this is the ultimate issue. I mean, the unacceptable politically, socially, morally unacceptable levels of inequality in our society are causing all the social and deep political fissures that we have in our society. What I mean by structural reform: deep reforms around labour, deep reforms around state enterprises, and deep reforms about a bloated public sector service. None of this is politically palatable, but I'm afraid it's essential.
But what we need now, Martin, during this time of COVID, is not fewer civil servants, but more, because it is the public service workers who are carrying us through the front lines. It's more doctors, it's more nurses, it's the teachers who are going out there to teach our children, even in spite of this life-threatening pandemic. And to talk of cutting them back now that as soon as we have fought the crisis, isn't it counterintuitive, really?
You talk about two ministries, Tendeka, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. I think there's far, far more scope in other ministries to make those cuts, and those cuts undoubtedly will come. And let me ask you this: there's a pain that's being felt by in the economy through this COVID-19 crisis. I think the decimation of small enterprises, the pain felt by big corporates. The only workforces here that have not taken a haircut on salaries is the public service. So I don't see why that does, to trim the high cost and yet, generally speaking, inefficient public service. I don't see why that cannot happen. I'm not talking, of course, by cutting essential healthcare workers at a time of a pandemic. I mean, no one in their right mind would call for that, and particularly the educational requirements and needs in our society. No one's talking about cutting teachers.
Martin, it almost strikes me.
Certainly is to cut.
It almost strikes me as interesting that when elites talk about the cutting of jobs in the public sector, people seldom think about the societies from which those people are drawn, and what would happen to the viability of those households, and what would happen, what that would do to the rest of the economy. Also, they seldom speak about the decimation of jobs through the successive years of deindustrialization and the decimation of our industrial base that Hajun Chan was speaking about, that has created generations of joblessness. Surely that's an economic crisis more scandalous than the fact that our civil service is just too blatant. When an economy and its economic planners no longer serve the society, what do you do then?
Well, I take it. No one will dispute the fact that we need an efficient, agile, value for money public service. That's what we pay our taxes for. The deindustrialization story, I would argue, is being contributed by, relatively speaking, poorly implemented policy over the course of recent decades. So, to equate the two, of course, any job loss is particularly these times, is tragic. However, if everyone worked for government, I'm afraid, and everyone was a public sector worker, I'm afraid that that's a very utopian socialist ideal that would never come about.
Well, I've seen a lot of economic research from reputable economists that suggest a positive correlation between very high interest rates or high cost of capital and massive unemployment.
Yeah, uncertainty. I mean, for sure. I mean, the high cost of capital we see. I mean, what we've seen in post-2008 September is capital effectively in the advanced economy is basically free. That's what QE results in. In our country, the high cost of capital and in Africa generally, of course, is an impediment to private sector growth because it's very difficult to start businesses and finance business because of that cost of capital. So that's a very different issue than having a bloated public sector service.
Thank you very much, Martin Davis, for joining us this evening. That's all we have for you tonight. Thank you very much for joining this riveting edition of Economics Unbound. Good night.